Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another episode on Relentless Pursuit of Purpose, where our goal is to help you enter into a confirmed, confident, and eternal relationship with the source of all life and purpose. If you've not already done so, please make sure and hit the subscribe button so that you never miss a video or an interview. So tonight, I am pleased to be joined by my good friend, Clark Bates. We're going to get into the reason for this particular discussion in a minute, but Clark, it's good to see you again, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. It's great to see you again. It's been a while, a couple years now, I guess, since we've seen each other.
Yes. I missed ETS this year. I'm not sure if you went, but
yeah. Oh yeah, I wasn't able to go. I went to was able to go to SBL, which is right after it, but both like last year. So
yeah.
We saw each other last year in Denver, didn't we?
Yep.
Yeah, so much has happened.
So much has happened. So much is happening. Let's start right there. You're at the university. Well, I won't say unless you want to say, but you're at a university in England and you're doing your research, finishing your PhD. Can you just kind of give us a little bit of insight into what specific area of interest you are delving into?
Certainly, yeah. I'm at the University of Birmingham in England. It's a town most people in the U.S. don't know about, but it's the second largest city in England, and it has a fairly large university there. I work with the Institute for Textual Scholarship and Electronic Editing. It's called ITSE for short, and the main focus of that institute is to work on editions of the Greek New Testament. So those of you that are familiar with sort of the Greek New Testaments, the different volumes that come out, maybe you've heard words like CBGM or ECM. A lot of that happens through the institute that I work with. My direct supervisor is the editor of the upcoming new Nestle Aland Greek, or the UBS Greek New Testament, the red one. If you've ever gotten the Greek New Testament, there's blue ones and there's red ones. The red one is the new one is coming out soon, and he is the editor for that. So I work a lot with biblical manuscripts, New Testament manuscripts, but my research specifically is dealing with type of commentary manuscript. And these commentaries are different than what you might see in modern commentaries and even ancient commentaries. It's not a single author. What has been done is that the editor of these commentaries has taken segments of other patristic sources and put them all together, compiled them as if it's a single author, and it's created this particular type of commentary, and they're popular from about the 7th century, really until about the 16th. So we have manuscripts of these commentaries for about 3 or 4 centuries, none going back far enough to the 7th, but at least to the 10th and on. And so I spent a lot of time my first few years going through these manuscripts, examining them, particularly in the book of Ephesians. And my whole goal was to create an edition of these commentaries, a Greek critical edition, which you do by comparing all the manuscripts that we have of them, picking the ones that you feel are the most important, and then doing a comparison of all those and recording all the differences, and then deciding on the text, which one is the better reading, which one is the more reliable reading. And then I did that, and I translated it all into English. And so now I am finishing up by writing my commentary on that commentary, trying to explain the theology that's contained within it and what it means. And so, yeah, it's probably the first of its kind for this particular type of work. And so it is definitely a brand new thing. So hopefully it will be something that is helpful to scholarship and even to the church as a whole when it's all done.
Wow. I knew most of that, but every time I hear you talk about it, it's like, wow, like that's another level of scholarship that I think a lot of people, but I'm glad, because I think people need to be aware, especially skeptics, that they need to be aware of this is not happenstance. This is not a fly-by-night operation as far as biblical understanding or interpretation or textual criticism. This is a richly in-depth process that is much bigger than most people realize. Even that the institute and the places you work at, some of the places you've traveled to even look at different manuscripts and do. I mean, that's a level of research that I think people need to be aware of.
Yeah, I think so too. I think I don't know how many people in the church even know it, but there's a lot in sort of your armchair sort of secular community. They really don't understand the amount of sort of just the amount of, I don't even call it academic work, the amount of intellectual work that has gone on literally from the beginning of Christianity to now. Even with, I get to spend all this time researching, reading in patristic sources and church fathers and things that I've never even read before because they're only in Greek, and now I have to read them in that. And it's unbelievable the intellectual thought that that we sit on the shoulders of in Christian tradition. And that's to say nothing of the amount of expertise that goes into even looking at Greek that we do now with like the science of looking at Greek manuscripts and text and making those comparisons. So yeah, I think it would be really helpful for the wider church to be more aware of the amount of intellectual sort of ingenuity that is behind the Christian faith all over the world. So
Yeah. Amen to that. And I remember on a much earlier, maybe 3 years ago, discussion you and I had, and we were talking about not specifically this, but the fact that if you like books, which I do, then thank Christians, right? And with that being said, a few Christians have devised another book, Faith Examined.
There it is.
There it is right there. And I'll put a shot on the screen for everybody. Faith Examined, New Arguments for Persistent Questions, Essays in Honor of Dr. Frank Turek. Edited, led, spearheaded by good friend here, Clark Bates. So let me just ask you first, before we get into the actual chapters in the book, what was kind of your, because you kind of united us, the different chapter authors, and you kind of reeled it in, you kind of quarterbacked the whole process. What was your desire for doing a project like this?
Yeah, it's interesting because it says it in the introduction. If you get the book, it'll tell you a little bit of what happened in the beginning. But this started about 4 years ago. Before I'd even come to the UK, I was moving away from actively doing apologetics. I used to run an apologetics website and go speak at churches and those sorts of things. And as I was finishing up my my Master's of Theology degree and knew I was heading toward a PhD, it was really clear that I was not going to have time for both. And so I had just recently signed off of my account. I wrote, kind of a final goodbye post, and it was kind of a bittersweet moment to end that part of my life for a while, at least. And I was, one of those times of reflection. And I started to think back to, of course, Frank Turek in the Cross-Examined Instructors Academy, and how that was sort of a big beginning point for how my apologetics trajectory went. I had been doing it a little bit prior to that, but really not with any kind of clarity or guidance, just sort of reading some Josh McDowell books and things like that, and working from there. But going there and talking with Frank and learning from him, and then all the other speakers that were there, and you were there. This is where we met. It really kind of gave me focus. It made me realize what I wanted to focus on in my apologetics work, and it ultimately became what I wanted to focus on in my academic work, which is really just the New Testament, its reliability, and its history, which sort of seeped into doing church history, which is another thing that I love. And so as I thought about that, I also was reflecting on the fact that I don't know that Frank would ever get any sort of a celebratory work, like nothing to give him sort of the praise that I kind of felt like he deserved, because I knew I wasn't alone with this. We both know a lot of apologists that have gone on to real apologetics careers that started with Frank and CIA. And I was reminded that in the academic world, we write books for professors when they retire that are called a Festschrift, which is just a German word for celebratory writing. And usually you get the professor's students, past and present, to write chapters, people that know them well, and then it's presented to them and they retire. Now, obviously, Frank probably won't retire ever. I can imagine he would still be doing this with a walker if he has to. But I thought it would be really nice to see that done for him. And then I had the idea, it would be really great if we did it through the CIA graduates. And so I started thinking through and actually reached out to a few people I knew to see, because I wanted it to be past and present, not just the years that I would have been there. And so I started looking into who had gone on from CIA to do things either in academic work and maybe in science or in apologetics, and where they were. And then from that, I could sort of compiled the reasoning for picking authors and started approaching them. Yeah, and everybody was just super excited to get on board with it. They loved the idea. And we started working that out. I didn't tell anybody what they were to write on, as you know. I wanted them to play off of I knew most people had a theme that they ran with, but I wanted them to feel the freedom to write it how they wanted. I didn't want to tell them what to do. And so that was really the assignment. And then I had to go find a publisher with the idea, and that took quite a while because right after that, COVID happened,
Yeah.
and everyone stopped doing everything, and even publishers were being very hesitant on even looking at new material. Then there was, probably heard there was a paper shortage for a while. Some books weren't getting printed, so everybody just sort of went into a panic mode, and it stalled for, I guess, about 2 years, maybe a year and a half at least.
Yeah.
And then, but then we were able to get a hold of a publisher, and they liked the idea, and so we got that. I signed the agreement for that, and that's when everything started rolling. And I think from start to finish, I think it probably lasted about a year,
Yeah.
from getting the contract to getting it all put together. But yeah, once that happened, it was really exciting, and it was just a matter of trying to surprise Frank and not let him know what happened.
Yeah, no, that was well done, and way to stick with it, way to keep us on our toes. I know I had to be reminded a couple times to get my deadlines met, but I thank you for that. But I mean, I just can't imagine putting a project like this together. People all over the country, you're trying to coordinate them. You're all over the world, so
Yeah.
well done. Let me give you your flowers as well while you're here, for getting that all knocked out.
I'm probably the last person to submit a chapter in reality, but
We just didn't know, right?
yeah, I didn't spread that around.
All right. Well, let's we're not going to give it all away, but let's just talk a brief synopsis of how, and I don't know how much the publisher kind of said this is how we want to organize it, and how much you said we want it to be like this.
Entirely me. The publisher gave some feedback, but as far as the arrangement, this sort of was what I had in mind mostly from the beginning, really. But the way the chapters fell, I had no plan on that because I didn't know what everybody was going to write.
Oh, wow.
It just sort of, as I knew that I wanted to break it off into sections, and originally I was going to try to do it in sections like Frank's 4 questions. Does truth exist? Does God exist? What about those sort of things? That was my original idea. But then as I saw the way the chapters sort of started to map out, I kind of put them all on a table and was looking at them. I could see the general range in which they're following, and that became the divisions for the book. So
yeah, so I love that. I think so. We got science, philosophy, the Bible, and the church. I mean, obviously, a lot of us in CIA, we're gonna get a heavy dose of the scientific arguments and those types of things that we do need, as well as the Bible. As far as a lot of what your chapter kind of delved into is, we'll get the can I trust the Bible and information on that and archaeology. But I think in apologetics, and my way of coming into apologetics was kind of like backwards, I guess, or reverse, where I was ministering, doing youth ministry. I was a pastor before I ever heard the word apologetics. And then this kind of took me in a different direction. But the church, that last section, I think there's some, theologians, maybe biblical historians, they tackle the church part, and then apologists are kind of like over here. I'm in both because I am still a pastor, and I do so many different things, but I think it's very helpful for the church to broadly understand the need for the church to be more engaged in apologetics. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And I do think most of these chapters will give something to people working in ministry. Our last 2 chapters obviously are directed at people in the church. Natasha obviously is writing to parents, and where her wheelhouse really is dealing with parents and kids. And then Melissa is speaking directly to people in the church and at churches, community. And I think some of the other things, I mean, even like Elisa's chapter deals with some false teachings that could get into your church, and then of course with your chapter, you've got a big discussion about, where do we find these objective truths that we live by, and how does it work? And honestly, I think that's something that's the church needs to know. I think as a community of people, there's not going to be a lot of time where the pulpit's going to be preaching about abiogenesis. Not to say that William's chapter, and I think Williams praises all the time. It's such a good chapter. Yeah. But there is this, and this is when we talk about your chapter a bit, that we can talk about this more, but there's this sense where people in the church take for granted what they believe, especially if they're not confronted with people who believe differently. But then when they are, they lack the ability to explain why they believe it.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that going back to because the Bible says is necessarily a bad thing, because we do put a lot of authority in what the Bible says, but knowing how to make that how to get to that point is still just as important as sort of looking at objective truth and natural law and those sorts of things. So yeah, I think there's a lot in here that can be really helpful to just your average Christian. And I think we tried to keep the discussions at a slightly academic level, but it's also still in the range where I think it's approachable by most people. I don't think it's going to be above too many people to kind of broach into. Like I said, there might be sections in certain chapters that are a little bit more intense, but for the most part, it's all been arranged to be more approachable to everybody.
Yes, absolutely. Well, with that being said, let's jump in to we can do your chapter and we'll look at my chapter real quick.
Okay.
You write, when someone asks about biblical manuscripts or about the existence of Sodom and Gomorrah, what they really are asking is, can I trust this book to be an accurate guide for my life?
Yeah.
They're seeking a trustworthy voice outside themselves. Understanding this underlying question casts skeptical interlocutors into a different light. And if Christians seek to answer this question above all, engagements can be less about being right and more about speaking truth in love, which is another apologetic issue that we sometimes see, right? The truth supersedes the love part, right? And so I love that you said that. So just with that as our kind of guiding light for maybe the conversation and even for the heart of this book, because we do all the authors that I'm aware of and know in the book, we do try our best to speak the truth in love. Yeah. Frank's a New Jersey guy, but I know he does the same thing as well. So even if everyone doesn't see that, but he is honestly, truly has a heart for people and a heart for the lost. So yeah, just with that quote and framing the question as, yes, this person has an issue with the Bible. Maybe they do, but they really have a deeper issue, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times they do. So yeah, just what were you thinking when you were writing that?
Yeah, and that really is it. I think in my experience, so in my sort of wheelhouse, it's always been dealing with the Bible, particularly New Testament, but also in the Old Testament to some degree, and arguments generally revolve around reliability and historical reliability or reliability of the text and those sorts of things, and that's all very technical in some ways and very sort of pragmatic, but the conversations rarely would ever get beyond that. I would listen to, I could even listen to, and I think while writing this chapter, I was listening to a debate, and it was really clear to me that no matter how right maybe the Christian debater was, they weren't really listening to their opposition, because the opposition he was defending what he thought to be a more reasonable approach to sort of the miraculous in the Bible. And the response kept swirling around textual reliability and historical reliability. And I kept thinking to myself, that's not what this person's asking. That's not what they're arguing against. Their objection is the miraculous. And their objection is they don't think this can really happen. Because if it does really happen, then they have to change a lot about how they see the world. And we can argue until we're blue in the face about how reliable the text of the Bible is. But if you don't believe in miracles, it doesn't matter. It could be very reliable text and still communicate something that's completely wrong, or completely untrue. And so as I was thinking about writing this chapter, one of the things I want to remind people, and I try to offer some sort of just examples of defending the Bible from textual reliability and historical reliability. But the real question that people want to know, in most cases, speaking generally, is whether or not this is going to speak into their life with truth. The idea that I kind of begin this chapter in a little bit with a talk about language, and I end it in the same way, because we'll get a little heady here, but the philosopher of language, Wittgenstein was his name, and he would argue that all of sort of humanity is looking for someone to speak into their life. But he didn't believe anything outside of humanity existed that could do that. So ultimately, we were speaking into our own lives. And really, that's still I think that's true, I think. And I think that's still what people are trying to find. And we attach that authority to all sorts of things, right? Whether it's a different religious book, whether it's the news, whether it's our, secular thinkers of some kind, but we let them be the authority, or sometimes ourselves. And yet that's what people are asking of the Bible. That's really what's being asked when you say, did this really happen? Or how do you know that that is what Matthew said, really? Or how do you know these are the words of Jesus? Someone's wanting to know, is this really able to speak into my life? And that's what I hope people remember, is that they're looking for a guide. And you can help them find that, but don't forget what they're really asking you.
And that's so good. And maybe as we do this, maybe we'll just kind of go back and forth between yours and mine, because there's a lot of connection, and I think this is good for people to understand too. That I made a post one time. It said, until we bring the lecture hall to the town hall, we the Christians, we don't have the voice we need or want. You are, and just not. I'm not saying you're just in an ivory tower all day, but you know people like that, and we need them, but we have to connect all the dots, that there are people who need the information that you are in front of every day, who don't have that privilege to be there, but they need to see how that translate, like you said, into their real life every day. And so let me give everyone watching an example, because I have the benefit of knowing Clark and of being trained by Frank. And so one of the things I do is teaching in prison. And I can tell you that it does have a tangible real world effect when people get a better understanding of the Bible. And so I can answer some questions, and I won't give them all of the Greek translation, but I can give them the understanding of, no, this is the type of research that's gone into making sure that these documents are reliable. And now we can read it, and then they have more hope and faith because of it. So I just want everyone to see that there is a connection, there is a through line, that when we do great research and we have active church members or Christians, those two things go hand in hand. So I just wanted to connect those dots.
And actually, let me spring off that for a second with your chapter, because I think yours is one of the sort of one of the few chapters in the book that really delves into or draws from your experience working with people, with youth especially. And I was going to ask you, as far as from your experience, when you talk to young people, especially you're dealing with, as I understand, you're dealing with inner city kids and kids with troubled backgrounds and all sorts of things. You're trying to convey to them purpose and value, right? You're trying to communicate things to them that maybe that they don't get from their family. And so, how do you see apologetics as a discipline, let's just say, being useful to you in that? How do you take it from the book world that you just find edifying to your own faith and try to communicate that to people that aren't going to read the books?
That's a really good question, and it's difficult at times. I try to tailor, obviously, the message depending on the audience. Part of it, though, is in the confidence that I have, that people can recognize people who really believe what they're saying versus people who are pretending. So, especially, for example, going back to jail, there's a penalty for being fake. I mean, within where they live, and so they even coming to a Bible study in their unit, they've exposed themselves, that they're saying, this is who I am. I'm not affiliated with any gangs or anything. But if you're found to not really be true to that, there's going to be consequences. So what I actually find is a lot of the brothers on the inside that really come and are consistent, they are all in, gung ho for Jesus, like legitimately, because it is real. That the other thing they have is time to study. And I say sometimes they would put a lot of us to shame out here with their understanding. So then I flip that to a lot of times talking to some youth, and the hunger is different, but it's partially because they don't know what they should be hungry for. So part of the reason I not shift or talk about purpose and meaning so much is that everyone is hungry for that, whether they admit it or not. I'm just saying the only way to ground meaning or purpose is in God. And if you get to know him, you'll have actual, or we say bona fide purpose or meaning, as opposed to the make it up as you go mentality of the current world.
Absolutely.
I think I see I don't expect them to remember everything I say about a cosmological argument or about epistemology or this or that. And I really don't go into all those things most of the time. But I do hope that if they leave there with a hunger to go learn more on their own, then it's a win for me. And so I was speaking to a young adult ministry a couple weeks ago, and I did get into a little bit of epistemology and ontology, but it was for the purpose of showing the ontological uniqueness of Jesus.
Okay.
So it wasn't just to show big words. It was to show like he's utterly unique out of every religious guru or leader or prophet you look at in every discipline. He's not in the same category. Another one of our trainers, Jim Warner Wallace, in his last book, Forensic Faith. No, not Forensic Faith. Person of Interest. He really made that case that look at music, look at literature, look at art. You can't get Jesus out of the picture. So I want them to see, youth, young adults, everyone, to see if there is any hope, it's only in Jesus. And if there is any meaning in life, it's only through him. And the more you get to know him, and you can trust that you can know him because of people like Clark. And there's how it all connects.
All right. That's excellent. Yeah. Thanks for answering that. I was just curious about how you would approach that.
Yeah. I do get some blank looks once in a while, but that's what Q&A is for. So in your section, or in your chapter, I should say, there's a few objections that you deal with initially. And I want to just give us kind of the highlight of the objection and kind of maybe 1 or 2 points why this may not work. And I think, let me preface this too, because in my chapter, it's in the philosophy section. People need to also understand, even I've been debating this, even the name of my organization, Proof for the Truth. I know most good apologists know we're not proving, but we're giving evidence in support of a particular position. So I just want to clarify that, because some of the objections that people lob, us kind of taking down that objection doesn't automatically prove Christianity is true. It just means that objection itself is not valid. All right. So it's two different sides of things. I think the idea of proof, in modern English, we've kind of gone away from sort of proof and evidence are the same thing, really. It's to say two words are the same thing. And, we talk about proving something, and in the modern day, we think that means beyond any doubt, it's defined, determined. But really, you offer proofs in science to forge your claim. And I don't think anybody would, depending on you, me, but I don't know that anybody, at least in science or even in most fields, would say that you'll ever get to a 100% certainty on anything. Right.
But,
Right. And that's a good point, because some skeptics, they seem to say, if I don't have 100%, I'm not going. And that's just an unreasonable standard. So, all right, this first objection, you said, some people object, saying there's no sufficient written language that existed at the time of the biblical patriarchs. So what would you say to that, as you've read all of their languages?
This is, and one of the things I'll say about the objections I came to with, and I actually removed one because it was just making things too long. But I went with some a little bit more obscure. I don't know how often you're going to get this, but then I started to doubt, like maybe I went too obscure with some of these. But after I wrote the book, I started actually seeing them pop up on social media in articles and things. So I was like, okay, well maybe I wasn't so far off.
Right.
There is a lot of discussion, even just in your news journals, things like that, about language and the origins of language. And you do often hear some form of an argument about education level, intelligence level, that sort of thing. Now, I admit, even in the chapter, that the majority of scholarship doesn't believe that the patriarchs wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Okay, they don't even believe Moses wrote it, let alone Abraham or anybody else had anything to do with it. But one of these more mainstream skeptical arguments would be there'd be no way for them to even write the information because there was no written language. And people often point to sort of Egyptian cultures and things like that as the origin of language. When in reality, a lot of very recent work has happened in discovering ancient languages. And that's I bring some of that evidence up in the chapter. And it actually pushes the earliest known alphabet back to right about the time of what you might date Abraham.
Wow.
So we're dealing with datings and things like that is a bit difficult. But and some would say, well, it's not a complete alphabetical system back then, or it's not a language, but it's a way of communicating. And that's
Yeah.
really what language is. Language is a means of written communication. Well, language is a means of communication through sound, but writing speech down is this written communication. So it can take all sorts of forms, pictography as well as an alphabet. And so we actually do have early forms of language that would be old enough that were Abraham to write something, there would be a means and an intelligence and awareness to do it. This is something that's big. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine. And I try to always point this out because there seems to be, and I had it too, there seems to be a misunderstanding in most people that ancient peoples were really inferior to us.
Mm.
They didn't have the intelligence, they didn't have the knowledge of the world, they lacked the technology, whatever. And all I can say is I have now spent several years uh, going around different places, just as I've had the opportunities, different museums, different uh, ruins of ancient Rome, different areas that have even older things from the Greeks and beyond. And I can tell you right now, they did not lack any of the intelligence that we have today. They might have lacked the technology, but that didn't mean they weren't able to do everything that we're able to do. It's a remarkable thing to see, to look at sort of what you might even think of as almost caveman-esque tools, and realize these are just as refined, given the technology they had, as something we might make today. I've seen glass work that was made from Pompeii, preserved after the explosion. You'd be hard pressed to find something better on the shelf of a Target. They're made, in by hand by these people, and these are just artisan things. But it points to the bigger reality that these were not human beings lacking in intelligence. Okay, right. And we got to remind ourselves of that. It's a very very fallacious thing to think that just because we happen to rest at this point in history that somehow we're superior. If that's the case, the people 1,000 years from now are going to think the same thing of us.
Right.
We'd be aware of that. But yeah, so the alphabetical system works back. Then I kind of go toward an actual functioning alphabet, which really the oldest form of a written language dates right around the time of what we might say is the oldest date for the Exodus.
Okay.
And then if you go to the more recent dating of the Exodus, you definitely have a full language. So my ultimate argument is simply that not only does Moses have the training and the education, if he's the author of the Pentateuch, because he's raised by Egyptians, he would also have access to the language and the written system and the written records that would exist prior to him, because the Egyptians kept records of such things. And I honestly don't think it's that far of a stretch to think that the patriarchs and people of their era recorded in some way things that happened in their lifetime, from which Moses may or may not have drawn from to write the Pentateuch if he is the author of that. So I'm simply pointing out that you can have a couple different varying viewpoints of how that part of the Old Testament comes together, but you can't argue that they lacked the ability, even as far back as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to record the details. And so, yes, that's that response in a nutshell. Maybe a big nutshell, but still a nutshell.
No, that was a very tightly packed nutshell. So, I mean, we know, right, that there are Egyptian writings or hieroglyphics or something from those times, and we know Moses, like you said, trained in Egypt. If anyone would have had the training, I would think he'd be the one, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Especially at that time. So it actually makes a lot more sense. And I was interviewing an archaeologist one time, and the thing about archaeology and stuff that you even talk about and stuff that you find or get to look at firsthand is, if I'm talking about the cosmological argument, maybe somebody can disagree. There's not anything we're touching. But when you're touching an artifact, when you're looking at a stela, when you're looking at a 4th century manuscript, when you're looking at the thing, you can't deny its existence, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I think that's when you find those evidences of earlier written language, it's hard to deny. Okay, you have another one here that says the authors of the New Testament were unscientific.
Yeah, that one that has come up before. This idea that they're flat earthers, I think, is one of the things I bring up in there. This idea that, because I've seen, if you spend any time on sort of social media, you'll see those sort of objections pop up that, Christians, you believe in flat earth and this sort of thing, just because you believe in this ancient cosmology and these sort of things. And so I kind of put to bed the idea of the flat earth specifically, and a specific argument that I've seen also come up from a few people that maybe read a little bit more about how they think they would argue that, the authors of the New Testament or the Bible in general believed in sort of a three-stage cosmos and that sort of thing. And I kind of put that to bed, at least for the time of the New Testament, that that's not what they would have thought. And one of the things, and I'm a little bit biased because my expertise is in Greek more than it is in Hebrew anymore. But there is a lot that's been written on the sort of the Jewish nature of the New Testament and the authors, and I think that's a very good thing to think about. It's something that's important. It's vital to the message that they're giving. You can't really understand the message of Jesus and the way he's depicted throughout the New Testament without a proper understanding of the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible and how it presents what's to come. But when it comes to their actual sort of world circumstances, they're living in a Greek-dominated society. And so one of the things I want to point out in this response is simply to show people I don't know how many people have ever heard of what the Greeks actually were capable of doing in those days and before, and how the philosophers and the mathematicians were so accurate. Again, it goes back to my argument that the ancients were not stupid.
Right.
And I present quite a few things to defend the argument that the Greeks were incredibly intelligent. There was they had no belief that the earth was flat. They measured the circumference of it through math and without any means to actually measure it. And even today, their measurement is within 100 kilometers right.
Holy cow.
Which is huge. I mean, imagine that. Imagine measuring the earth with nothing but math and getting it almost exactly right.
That's amazing.
So it's one thing to think about. But, pointing to the fact that the language of, they're the origin of a lot of medicine in the Western world comes from them. The Greek language is still used in that. And then I take time to show how particularly Luke uses that. And I admit, I'm using the one author that is definitely Greek and happens to be believed to be a doctor. So, he has a bit of a special standing among the authors. But the point ultimately is to show you that if he is in fact a physician, he does use the language of a physician in Greek, which is fascinating in and of itself. And so it's simply to point out that you're dealing with men that are not, they're not scientists, but they're not uneducated. They do know what they're doing. Yes, some of them are fishermen. That doesn't make them foolish. They're still going to be. They're still aware of the teaching. Even the rabbis they learn from were taught these things, so they're still learning it as they go to synagogue. They're going to be able to communicate in other languages because they have to. They have to be able to communicate with Romans and they have to be able to communicate with Greeks as well as Hebrews. So, there's all these things that they do and they can do. And so these sort of arguments that are meant to silence opposition don't actually hold water if you take the time to learn about the history and the world of that time.
Yeah, that's really well said. You reminded me, I was reading a book a few months ago called The Art of More, I think. But it's essentially a book about how math created the world.
Yeah.
And how, it was funny. It was interesting to read. There was math battles and like this mathematician didn't like that one. And it was like, they don't like algebra over here. And so anyway, it was interesting from that point. But as you said, we can look at, you've been there to a lot of these places and you're over there in a lot of the history. I was over in England last year and in Europe, especially when you look up and you see the Sistine Chapel or you see some of these things that were done, how did they get up there? Like, this is all math. It's the vectors, the angles, it's amazing that, like you said, without a really long measuring tape, they didn't have any of those things, and they got the math right. The buildings are still standing, which is incredible. So, yeah, thank you for pointing that out. That we have to take a broader look at the culture they were in. Right. All right. One more objection you had here: the gospel stories are invented.
Yeah, no, that's of course that's a very common one. That's been going on for a long, long time. And I spend a little bit of time with that, probably maybe not as much as I did on the other ones, but really trying to point out how you and this is really an old argument. I mean, even C.S. Lewis had a point talked about this, but that you wouldn't have been able to invent it at that time. We can think of it as being invented largely today because we read the Gospels, and in the actual story permeates every fictional story that we engage with. Whether it's a movie, a cartoon, or a book. There are lots of work that have been written on identifying these sort of parallels in storytelling. But prior to that point, you're dealing with a group of people that would have had to completely invent ex nihilo, basically, some concepts that no one was thinking about and no one was talking about, and even more importantly, no one would have received,
Right.
And passing them off as truth. And really what it comes down to is the person of Jesus, particularly in the Gospels, because, and this goes beyond sort of the fulfillment of prophecy angle or even sort of the teaching angle, but really just tries to identify the fact that everything that the gospel narrators give you about Jesus comes within the greater context of the Old Testament. And that's why I said it's important to know your Hebrew Bible to really get this. But all of the things that he does point back to something you can find in the Old Testament to verify who he is. And if none of that's true, if nothing that he said, or even just the miraculous, because even the miracles signify something that's going on, was foreshadowed in the Old Testament. If none of that's true, if it's all invented, then all of the weight in which these stories are supposed to carry disappears, and so many things cease to make sense about the story. If Jesus isn't a real figure, for one, but even if he is a real figure and wasn't the figure that they describe, then the entirety of the New Testament message falls apart.
Yeah,
all of it. And so the kind of one of the I used to tell people that with the resurrection, they talk about, can we prove sort of that Jesus died on a cross? And one of the things I point out is, well, I mean, short of a snapshot, I don't think we can prove it 100%. But without it, there's this gaping cross-shaped hole in all of history.
Yeah.
And so you have to find what piece fits that hole. And so, going back to this idea that they invented the story, you're giving them much more credit than most skeptics want to give them as authors, because they are the most intelligent, forward-thinking authors that have ever existed in their time.
While those same people often call them unlearned and uneducated, right?
While they're simultaneously completely uneducated and flat earthers, and they've completely invented a figure in his hometown. And convinced everybody this is really who he was, even though most of the people they were talking to were alive at the time and would have known who he was anyway.
Right.
Oh, and so it just doesn't. It's one of those objections that usually gets thrown around to sort of silence opposition. But if you just take the time to sit with it and look into it, it falls apart again. So.
Yeah. Very true. Very true.
Yeah. So with your chapter, and for those that haven't seen this, obviously Alex is in the philosophy section. He's I think he's the first chapter in the philosophy section. He talks about sustaining purpose and sustaining value and sustaining hope. Essentially, there's this theme of sustaining in your chapter, and I wanted to, and you touched on this a little bit already, but I wanted to see how, and then maybe we can combine this with another question: that how you see the questions that young people, or even that the people you talk with, are asking about themselves and about the world, maybe shifting, and how you feel the importance of talking about a sustaining value, personal value, if you will, and even a sustaining hope, how they work with that shift. How does that answer those questions?
So sometimes when I speak, there will be this kind of 3-part thing I'll do that, without value, there's no meaning. Without meaning, there's no hope.
Yeah.
And I think people get it when I say it out loud, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think in the normal day-to-day life that a lot of people are asking the right questions. And what I mean, and this is going to answer the question about sustaining, is people know, generally speaking, how to do the activities of the day, go to work, and, you know how to do life, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But a lot of people will get to a point where that's all you're doing. It's just, you're doing life. And, we look at statistics, 70% of people say they don't like their job. I don't believe God created us or that we're here on earth to hate what we do 90% of the day.
Yeah, very good.
So it doesn't mean that everything about everything we do is going to be peaches and cream or easy. What you're doing is not easy, but your passion and your kingdom mindedness creates a different way of looking at even what you do, right?
Yeah.
If people knew that there was a hope that doesn't go away, the sustaining hope, if there was meaning that's permanent, it's not going to go away. It's not job specific. It's not if you get fired, you no longer have this. It's not that type of thing. There would be more fulfillment. There'd be more confidence. People would be more confident as they go through life. There'd be less hatred. So the tangents that flow from this are exponential. There'd be less poverty. There'd be less sin in general. So if we're operating in our perfect synergy with God and with each other, we're not stepping on each other's toes. We're growing with and for each other. I love the imagery of the body that Jesus used, and it's so helpful for us to understand that I have 10 fingers. I want all of them to be working at full operational capacity all the time. Therefore, as the body of Christ, I want you, Clark, to be at full operational capacity. In whatever way I can help you do that, that's better for you and for me. And if we don't see the synergy and the unity of the body, and this is the reason Jesus, the night before his execution, he prayed that we'd have unity. He could have prayed for a lot of stuff. But the one thing he said is like, I pray that the church that I leave, that grows rather, is going to be one, like a body, because that is the best way you're going to move forward. And so now we don't have to get into the ecclesiological issues of the day, but we're not unified. We'll just say that.
Sure.
And we're working towards that. So the sustaining aspect also comes from another more scientific, philosophical idea that a lot of times when I hear or read atheists, let's say there's 10 steps. It's as if they're starting at step 3, getting us to step 10 and saying we proved the case. I'm like, well, you cheated. How'd you get to number 3?
Yeah.
And so in the book, I talk about, for example, the noetic structure, which everybody may not understand, but let's say there has to be a thing such as the color red before you can say an apple is red, right? There are steps to this. So let's say cosmologically, if the only 2 options are something comes from nothing or something comes from someone, then you have to show your work essentially, like in math class. How did you get to whatever conclusion you're saying? So, we have our cosmological arguments, teleological arguments, all that. But the atheist still has to tell us who is your or what is your uncaused first cause. They're working on it as it pertains to people. We have this. We seem to have this sense of morality. Generally speaking, at a broad level, at least, we seem to have, whether people say it this way or not, some sense that I should be doing something or I'm here to do something. So coming back to the value, meaning, hope, if you can't substantiate value, meaning is just make believe, which means hope is just make believe. So people, I'm very spiritual nowadays, tapping into my inner, all this stuff you hear, it kind of goes back to what you said too, that if you're not given value and if you're not given meaning, you will spend the rest of your life trying to cobble that together.
Yeah.
And that is creating increased depression, increased anxiety, increased stress. Just look at all the data. So all these things connect. A misunderstanding of the Imago Dei will lead to a misunderstanding of meaning in life. Will also lead to a misunderstanding of the value of other humans, which might enable you to do some bad things to those humans because you don't understand their value. So this is not just getting the Bible right and knowing the scriptures and memorizing. This is real world consequences. I talked about Bonhoeffer and how he stood up to Nazism. I mean, at some point, Christians have to stand tall and actually put to use, in the orthopraxy sense, the orthodoxy that we get from Scripture. And
Mm-hmm.
the likelihood of doing that is far less if you misunderstand what
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is sustaining in his
Yeah.
own nature, if that
No.
makes sense.
Yeah. So I think what you come back to is, and I mean, it's funny because this is something that you see even in the ancient church, the ideas of, your work being more than just labor. That there's a labor that's good, and it's God honoring, and it doesn't matter what the labor is. It just matters on how you perceive its purpose.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly right. If we instill our own sense of value, our own sense of purpose into ourselves, we already know that it's really subjective. It's just
Yeah.
based on what we're hoping for, and ultimately, you never ever get this sense, the sustaining sense that you're going for. It's this idea: if I get that promotion, then I'll finally have that sense of peace. But it never comes because you've got to work more, and it takes more of your life, and we lose sight of that. That
Yeah.
Christians lose sight of that ultimate value, that ultimate sense. And I think that's something that I think everybody needs to be called back to,
Yeah.
including myself. So yeah, I like
Amen.
that.
We can both answer this. What do you see as, and for those who are just joining us, we're talking about Faith Exam, and a book Karkin has spearheaded that we've co-authored with some other authors. What do you see as the importance of this as a resource for churches to use, maybe in a small group Bible study or something like that?
Yeah, I think that one of the reasons, and this is one of the reasons it's set up the way it is with the different sections, I wanted to make it accessible that if a person or a group had specific questions about a certain type of objection, whether it be a scientific one or maybe more philosophical one, they could go right to that part of the book. But I think more than that, it asks questions of Christians that they're probably not asking themselves. And it's important that Christians do start talking about these things with each other. It's kind of like you're a parent and I'm a parent, and one of the things you always think about is that, the kids are going to learn about X somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's at school with their friends or whether it's on TV, but it'd probably be better if they learned it from you, so
Mm-hmm.
as their parents, so that they could at least learn it within the framework and the worldview that you're trying to instill in them. In the same way, I think that congregations need to be aware that you're going to be exposed to this, whether it's your kids or yourselves, or your even as pastors, it's your people. They're going to be exposed to different objections, and to whatever level that your congregation has been exposed to them before and found answers will determine how that impacts them. Deconstruction is a huge thing today. A lot of very, sort of quote unquote famous people, are coming out there sharing their deconstruction stories. And most of the time, the reason for it is unanswered questions, or they heard an objection that they couldn't get an answer to. And I don't necessarily believe they couldn't get an answer to it. I don't believe that they were really looking for the answer, but
Right.
but that also ultimately what it comes down to. And so a book like this is a great tool for churches to start to foolproof themselves against some of these things, and to really, like you said, see that there's an intellectual prowess in the church, that there, and it's a historical one to begin with. I mean, we've got a chapter that deals with 3 types of cosmological arguments that go back, hundreds, and they're actually 1,000 years in some cases. So it's getting yourself aware of that there are good responses to these objections, knowing what they are. You don't have to memorize it, but you have a resource and you know where you can go to get it. And then hopefully with some of the footnotes and some other things that are in the book, it can open your eyes up to other places you could go, and other resources you can look at, and you can grow that way. Now, no one has to become, the next Greg Kokel or Jay Warner Wallace or anything like that, but you do need, as a Christian, to know why you believe what you believe,
Yeah.
and to be able to answer to a changing world, what their give answers to their questions. So that's what I would say.
Oh, that's really well said. And I would just add that 2 things. One, we don't read. People don't read like they use. So you said something earlier about we have this imagination of we're so much more advanced than other. I don't even know if we're as advanced, comparatively speaking, from what we have access to versus what they had access to.
Yeah.
In other words, we have these, but the fact that you have Google doesn't mean you know more. It just means you can Google something. And so the practical nature of how to do things and just a basic understanding of reality and history, which was the second thing I was going to say. I was watching something the other day about one of the oldest churches, and there's these churches in Ethiopia that are in cliffs, right? And people have to like walk the sheer face of the cliff to get up to this church. And it's amazing. And then you get inside, and on the ceiling of these rock-hewn cliffs, there's paintings from like second century. And the dedication that I feel like the early church had to, hey, if this is what it is, then we need to know this thing, and we need to be about this life, to the distractions of today. It's so much easier, especially in the West, to be a Sunday Christian. And maybe not even Sunday, to be Easter and Christmas, right? So the fact that we have that ability under a generally low persecution level, comparatively speaking, I think it's actually hurting us. And I think our perceived intellect, our perceived power and prowess is actually hindering us from knowing God and from living with these understandings of meaning and hope. So I think that if we can connect the dots from the historical research that you do to the present day reality of what we're living in, that's the reason I think people should get a book like this, that you can see, okay, from science to philosophy to church history, there's a connection here. This is not just isolated topics. So
and I will say, I think, a lot of what's happening, at least in the American church, so I don't want to paint too broadly a brush, but in the Western church, let's say, in the Western American church, is when we do have disputes about things in the church, they're usually nothing. They're not. I don't want to say they're simple disputes or small things, because some matters they're not small. But we start arguing about things that ultimately are less important. I think one of the big ones I saw a while back was whether or not a certain type of humor was permissible in the pulpit, or certain language was permissible in the pulpit. And I was reminded, so I read a lot of John Chrysostom in my work. And if you haven't read John Chrysostom, you need to read John Chrysostom. He was one of the most influential preachers in the world and history of the church, and for good reason. And a lot of his work is in English, so it's fairly approachable. But one of the things he said, it reminded me that preaching hasn't changed much, is he deals with that in a sermon. And one of the things he says to his congregation is, the devil is walking around you like a lion, baring his teeth and ready to devour you. And you're concerned with whether or not you can make jokes in church. And, and I was like, wow, that's fairly timely. And it's not to say that, there are certain debates we have that are important, but be aware, people who are Christians, this is a really real thing. The devil is out there trying to get you. He's out there trying to get your children. He's out there trying to get everyone. And we need to be able to actually work to fight against that. So don't let him preoccupy you with debates like these that might have some value in a personal one-to-one dialogue. But don't let them become your end-all be-all. And as it comes back to a book like this, I'm not saying my book is this book is somehow supposed to take the place of other things. It's simply saying that there are tools out there that are going to help you in the larger questions. And those are where you should be focusing your most of your time and attention. Let's save the other things for coffee chats.
Yeah. Absolutely. I could not agree more. I cringe sometimes when I see certain debates that occur online. Because it makes us all look bad. And I know you're not like that. I'm not like that. And Frank's not even like that. He doesn't even, he's not even running his page, just in case anybody thinks he's being mean to them. All right. Well, thank you, Clark, for joining me. Thank you for spearheading this book. Everyone go get it. It is available on Amazon. Faith Examined, New Arguments for Persistent Questions and Essays in Honor of Frank Turek. I probably will have some other authors come on throughout the year as we get into that. Yeah, we'll go from there. I got some other exciting interviews coming up. Dr. Hugh Ross, Dr. Russell Moore, and a few others. So stay tuned for those. And until next time, peace.